Thanks, Amy, for that really nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to say up front, several people have asked me what paper this talk goes with, and there is no one paper, but I'm going to talk through a series of papers that I hope will address this question. So just in terms of framing what I'm going to be talking about today, I don't have to tell this audience that births are one of the pillars of things that we study in demography, along with migrations and death. And I think overall, we can look at the field and say demographers have really become increasingly better at counting births. We have lots of sources to count births. And, though we still have some persistent problems, births are often undercounted due to poor and non-existent vital registration systems. There's failure to report some of the neonatal deaths. And also, we tend to focus more on births than pregnancies, so there are things that we miss out in the process. But what I'd really like to talk about today is some of the things that are in the pathway to births that I think as demographers and sociologists we often don't measure. And I'd like to shed some light on some things that we've been doing to try and measure things differently or think about things that we haven't been measuring at all. And I think in part why we're missing some of these things is that births tend to be a hard outcome that are relatively easy to measure compared to some of the things that I'll be talking about. Again, a very familiar framework is the approximate determinants of fertility, and referencing John Bongart's classic work from 1978, he really helps us think about ways to quantify and simplify intermediate variables that impact the overall fertility of different countries. These intermediate variables, as I'm sure many of you know, include exposure variables such as the proportion married. And there is flexibility. It doesn't only have to be marital unions, but cohabiting unions would also count these days. Deliberate marital fertility control, including contraception and abortion. And I think there are questions around contraception and abortion that we need to be paying a bit more attention to. Natural marital fertility factors, including lactational infecundability, frequency of sexual intercourse, which we'll be talking about a bit more later on in this presentation, sterility, spontaneous intrauterine mortality, and duration of the fertile period. But oftentimes when we are looking at this framework, there are a lot of things that we really don't measure at all that may actually impact the fertility rate as well as the lives of women and couples and families. Some of these things could be considered sort of hard to quantify, and we'll be talking about some of those. And then there are those that are also maybe we think are too sensitive to even try and ask or really do research on. So just to give you a sense of where we're going in the next 45 minutes, I've divided this talk into 4 sections. The first is just ask. The second is ask differently. The third is already asked. And then the fourth, and maybe the most fun, is do we dare to ask? So hopefully we'll be able to touch on these issues as I go through the presentation. If there are questions of clarification, please just raise your hand, but otherwise I prefer to take questions at the end. Okay, so we're going to kind of do a tour around the world and through a wide variety of studies, and hopefully you'll see the connections as we go through these studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the methodology of the studies, but I'm certainly happy to entertain any detailed questions you may have, either just after the talk or in the question and answer period. And I've tried to put references to all the papers on all the slides, so if you want to find them, you should be able to find the original papers, and if you can't, please feel free to email me. Okay, so in Just Ask, we're going to start out in New Delhi in India and talk a little bit about sexual behavior among adolescents in India. And part of the origins of this project that I did with one of my doctoral students was that people said you can never ask unmarried adolescent girls about sex. You just can't do it. We do surveys, but really you just can't get that data. So just keep that in mind. This first paper, just to give you some information about India, it's estimated that between 15 and 30% of boys and about 10% of girls who are adolescents report having premarital sex. Those estimates vary substantially, and we don't actually really know the actual number very well. There's very limited information on the circumstances surrounding sexual experiences of young people in India, particularly among unmarried women. And qualitative and limited quantitative data suggest that sexual coercion is a problem among adolescents in India. So she undertook a project, and I'll be talking more about the methods of this project in a few slides from now, but this is one piece that came out of this project. She was trying to figure out about consensual sexual experiences that young adolescents may have. So she asked them in a face-to-face interview, did someone ever try to touch you against your will? And if the respondent answered yes, he or she was asked who this person was, and then also asked, has someone ever tried to have a physical relationship with you against your will? This was pretty much as far as we could go in face-to-face interviews. We're not counting forced sex or rape in this, but what they defined as a physical relationship. So we can't really sort out that piece of it. If he or she answered yes, again, that she or he had a physical relationship against her will, she was asked who this person was. So in this survey, which I'll detail shortly, 32% of the boys and 42% of the girls reported that they were touched against their will. What was really surprising to us was that boys reported that their female friends were the person who most often touched them against their will. Girls reported that it was generally strangers, and that was 93%. 5% of the boys and 3% of the girls reported that someone forcibly tried to have a physical relationship with them. Again, we see the numbers are small, but we see boys reporting more than girls, which also was a little bit of a surprise. And again, it was boys reporting that their female friends often were the ones that forced them to have a physical relationship, or tried to force them to have a physical relationship, and girls reported that it was neighbors. So in that study, we found some surprising things, and really this was just face-to-face interviews where we elicited this information, and we were surprised that people did answer the question. So that was the first just ask. The second, we're going to go a little further away to the Philippines, and we're going to talk about some data that comes as an outgrowth of the Cebu Longitudinal Health and Nutrition Survey, which is an ongoing cohort, and a lot of work has been done on this study on many different realms. But we're going to do a little bit of talk about intimate partner violence, and again, thinking about relationships, and one of the pieces that's missing from perhaps the Bongart's framework. So around the world, we estimate, and you can see how precise these estimates are, between 10 and 69% of women report being physically assaulted by a male partner at some point in their life. And really, I mean, I'm joking about the precision of the estimates, but this range reflects the fact that the prevalence varies substantially from country to country, and also it's something that becomes difficult to report on in some settings. In developing countries, partner violence is the most common form of violence to which women are exposed. And intimate partner violence is an important public health problem, as its consequences on women's physical and emotional health can be extensive. However, we never really, until relatively recently, had any information about female perpetration of intimate partner violence. So, we have all of these surveys that document women as victims of violence, but we really didn't have anything on what females are doing. And so with my collaborators, we decided we would just ask. So very limited data exists. Advocates and researchers haven't considered male victimization as a significant problem, although anecdotally, if you talk to men experience violence at the hands of their female partners, and they don't want to talk about it because it's really gone. It's one of the things that we don't really have interventions for. We don't really know what to do about it. And so we decided in the Philippines to just embed some questions in an ongoing cohort study. We asked actually questions about perpetration and victimization from both males and females. And we asked this among adolescents, and we also asked this among the mothers of the adolescents. And the mothers are part of the cohort, as are the adolescents and the adolescent males and females who were born in 1983-84. Okay. So this reports on intimate partner violence among the young adults who are married or cohabiting, and these are early partnerships, and there's concern about the representativeness of this, and we can talk about those details if you'd like, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the data. So we actually asked a wide range of questions, but the ones that are used in this study were whether the person reports doing this, having this done to them, or doing this to their partner. So through something, pushed, grabbed, or shoved the other person, hit them but not with anything in their hand, hit them with something hard, or harm them enough to need medical attention. These questions come from a standardized scale called the conflict tactics scale, and these are pretty much the most severe questions on the scale. Okay, and so what we find are some surprising, but not surprising to my collaborators, results. So we divided the data up into the respondent being violent against a partner, the respondent reporting that the partner was violent toward him or her, that the violence was reciprocal, or that there was no violence. And what's most striking here is if we take a look at the respondent violence against partner. So on the left-hand side are the males. So 25% of males reported that they were violent against their partner. But when we look at the females, more than half the women report perpetrating violence against their partner. Yeah?
Doesn't context matter here? Because I often physically restrain my 3-year-old.
Yeah.
He then hits me.
Yes.
Right? So he's perpetrating violence against me.
Right.
But because I'm perpetrating violence against him. I mean,
yes.
I just...
Yes, I understand.
56% just, hitting their partners at random, or is the male partner doing...
Yeah,
Is he doing something that...
Right.
Provoking the violence?
Okay, so I agree with you completely. The context does matter. And so we have qualitative data on this as well that can provide some context that I'm not going to present here. Continually in the violence literature, we tend to, even now in the demographic and health surveys, we have all these questions on violence, but we don't have very much on who started the argument, what the argument was about, how it was resolved, who started first. But I know actually from qualitative work that we've done in this study with the same participants that females report actually starting the arguments and starting the violence. And you can see that there's really no gender difference in the reciprocal violence, but that females seem to be reporting perpetrating. In other data that we have from the mothers of these adolescents, mothers also report substantially higher rates of perpetration than we would have expected. So I think part of it, yes, it's context, but part of it is that we just never really bothered to ask women because either that we think it's sort of politically incorrect or it's not a public health problem or what have you. And I think we underestimate the impact on men, but clearly the context does matter. Okay. Oh, and just to say that these adolescents are in sort of relationships that are pretty close to age match. There's not really a big disparity in terms of ages, so it wouldn't be like a mother and a son fighting. Okay. So another thing that I think sort of falls in the category of just ask is thinking about couple relationship quality. And this is a concept that I started thinking about in relationship in some ways to fertility and some of the work that I do on household decision making. But the idea that we actually don't really know how couples feel about each other or how they work together or don't work together. These kinds of concepts haven't really been measured in lower income countries. We see a lot of studies that look at college students. You get experimented on as college students to look at your relationship quality. And we've seen some studies in Europe, but we haven't really seen any studies that are in developing countries. So we're going to move to sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm going to be talking about some work that's based on studies that are going on in 6 sub-Saharan African countries, Egypt and China. So as a background, there's really been limited exploration of the nature of marriage or stable unions and the quality of relationships in developing countries. I was suspecting or thinking that maybe relationship quality could be one of the explained factors for why women and couples are not using contraception. And psychologists have found that relationship quality is really important, but demographers and to some extent sociologists haven't really looked at these constructs. So as part of an ongoing cohort study in Ethiopia, Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, and Uganda, and then a somewhat different study in Egypt and China, we are embedded questions on marital relationship quality using standardized scales that have really only been used in Western countries. And just as a quick background on this study, this is called the Family Health and Wealth Study. It comes out of the department where I am, the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. It's sponsored by an institute in our department called the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health. And this study, in most sites, is a study of 500 couples and their households. They've already collected baseline data. Many of them are in the middle of collecting round 2 of the data. And these are in peri-urban areas, and they're done with university partners. So the things that we embedded into the questionnaire were couple communication, couple commitment, trust, and satisfaction. And just as a quick aside before I show you some of the results, is that we were really interested in adding these questions to this primarily demographic survey, but we were worried about how they would work. And we had a meeting with our African partners in Baltimore, and we decided to try out the couple relationship quality scales on them. You know, they're academics, very senior people in their field, but we figured why not, we had them captive, why not try out couple relationship quality scales? And you know, the first thing that was great was that they were so excited that people would be interested in these kinds of things, that no one had really asked these questions of them before. And then, of course, they would get a little bit embarrassed. You know, maybe some of the questions weren't quite right. And the only question that they changed was there was a question on physical affection about how often you kiss your partner. And they said, no, it can't be that. It has to change to hug. So we changed it to hug. But it was interesting to find that that was the question that they had the most problem with. Okay. We've done a lot of work looking at the reliability and the validity of the scales that we put in, which I'm not going to be showing you here, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it further. And we did some work looking at the relationship between these relationship quality measures and contraceptive use, because that was sort of the original thing we were interested in. And one thing to note is that the scales, while they work pretty well, and some questions need to be omitted, they tend to work a bit differently in each context. We ask these questions of both men and women, so we actually have couple data on couple relationship quality. We haven't really pursued that yet, still pending further analyses. But we looked at women's reports of their couple relationship quality as related to contraceptive use in 3 of our countries. And what we found is that in Ghana, women who reported a higher commitment reported that they were also more likely to be using a traditional method of contraception. And similarly, in Uganda, constructive communication was associated with traditional method use. In Nigeria, women reporting higher commitment remained marginally associated with modern contraceptive use. And we're still puzzling about why there would be an association with relationship quality and traditional method use, but one thing we're speculating on is the idea that traditional methods, while not effective as contraception, they actually require more negotiation with a partner. So if you think about withdrawal or periodic abstinence, that may actually require a better kind of communication between couples than some of the other methods. And the concern also, you know, with women and covert use of methods and what that means about their relationship is something also that we're quite interested in. Okay, so now we're moving on to phase 2, Ask Differently. We're back in India, And back to the same study that showed the non-consensual sex information. So I'm going to give you a little bit more information on why this is an ask differently kind of study. As I'm sure all of you know, face-to-face interviews are the most frequently used method of attaining information on a range of things, including adolescent sexual behavior. There's perennially concerns about underreporting. So a lot of, in the last decade or so, people have gotten really excited about ACASI, or audio computer assisted self-interviews, as a method to try and get more honest and sensitive reporting of behaviors. But there's still a concern. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but there are still places in the world where there are not a lot of people who are familiar with computers. There's still low literacy in many populations. And so, there's concern about how this works, how a method that's computer-based will work for low literacy populations. So again, this is based on work that was conducted by my doctoral student. We did a randomized study in Delhi among 583 boys and 475 girls ages 15 to 19. We compared young people's reports of their sexual behaviors in the standard face-to-face interview or with either the audio CASI or a locally developed method that we call interactive interviews. So for the ACASI component, she did substantial training. She did practice questions with all of the participants. Each question only had 4 possible response options: yes, no, don't know, and don't want to respond, or no response. And it was all visual. The participant heard the question and the possible responses through headphones and used the computer mouse to click on the selected response. For many of these young people, they had never used a computer before. So she taught them how to move the mouse well enough to be able to figure it out. She asked them a series of about 10 questions to make sure they understood how to use the mouse. So like what's the best music group in India? What film came out this year? I mean, questions that they could possibly answer and would be relevant. In addition, in the headphones, when the adolescents were listening, the gender was matched to the participant. So for males, they had a male voice, and for females, they had a female voice. And participants could go back and listen again if they didn't understand the question or weren't sure about their answer. The interactive methodology included some pretty novel things. The first was a 5-segment audio drama that recreated realistic situations. So talked about adolescents in different kinds of relationships and asked them, to think about that. She had made male and female dolls and showed them interacting in ways to make sure that you could communicate. So she tried to use these dolls to talk about same-sex behaviors, which is also relatively taboo. And participants were given a confidential individual response sheet for answering questions regarding heterosexual behaviors. The interview explained that the questions on the master sheet, which I'll show you in a moment, the interviewer explained them, and the respondent looked at the sheet, and then the respondent marked the responses confidentially and folded the response and put it in a box so that it was anonymous. And so this is an example of the respondent sheet to ask about sexual behavior. And she assures me that having a picture of a young man and woman in bed implies sex. And then the respondent was asked how they felt about this experience. And for the males, there were male faces, obviously, and for the females, female faces. And then she asked, what age was it when this happened, and what was your partner's age? So just some quick results from this. So in the first set of bars, we have the ACASI compared to face-to-face interviews. And among boys, you see a significantly higher report. Oops, sorry about that. A significantly higher report of ever having sex compared to face-to-face interviews. And then when you look at the interactive versus face-to-face, you also see a pretty significant difference at 28% versus 19.5%. And this held up after adjustment, but this is just the bivariate associations. For girls, you see no significant difference in reporting between the ACASI and the face-to-face. but the numbers are quite small. But you see significantly higher reports on the interactive method with the response card and the audio dramas compared to the face-to-face. And I can talk more about the methods here if people have questions. When we asked respondents, females tended to report enjoying filling the things out on the listening to the dramas and filling out the response sheet. They said they reported more honestly and they liked it better. The boys, maybe this doesn't come as a surprise, said that they liked the audio Cassie better, but they were more honest on the interactive methodology. Okay. The last Ask It Differently may not seem that different to many of you who do qualitative work. But one of the things that's been of interest recently is something that's going on with contraceptive use in Ghana. So according to the DHS, in 2008, women had an average of 4 children during their reproductive lifespan, down from 4.4 in 2003, and we see this kind of trend happening through a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. What we don't see is what's happening with contraceptive use. So in 2008, 17% of married women reported using a modern contraceptive method, down from 19% in 2003. And while the percentages of difference are small, the trend is a little bit concerning. And what the DHS shows, for those of you who are not familiar, there's a question on why you won't use contraception in the future, and sometimes there are questions about why they discontinued a method. And in these questions, it suggests that fear of side effects is a main reason for non-use. So I was really interested to learn a little bit more about why women say they're not using contraception. So we conducted 16 focus groups among 89 women in Accra, the capital. And what we did was we used vignette-based methods to elicit women's responses to situations to better understand why they thought contraceptive use was a problem or what problems they thought were going on. We told them 3 different stories about 3 different women. We didn't ask them to respond about themselves, although what I've been finding lately in focus groups is that women and men tend to respond about themselves even when you tell them they don't have to respond about themselves. So that's another methodologic issue that has been very interesting. But we talked about a young woman who was still in school, who was sexually active and was planning to stay sexually active with her boyfriend, and what kind of contraceptive method could she use. We talked about a married woman who had 4 children who couldn't afford to have any more children, and what kind of method could she use. And then we talked about a woman who had 1 child, had been using the injectable contraception before that birth, then had trouble conceiving. It took her 6 months to get pregnant, and she had some side effects, but now she wants to wait to have another child, so what kind of method could she use? So just to give you a snapshot of some of the results, we found that women who had never used contraception in our sample were really fearful of methods based on hearsay. And let me just point out that in our initial design, we stratified the focus groups to have current or ever users and never users. We had a horrible time trying to find current users in our sample. We almost couldn't find anybody, which maybe sort of suggests that there really is a problem with contraceptive use. So a woman who was in the 26 to 30-year-old age group who would come in for antenatal care said, I want to do a contraception, but because of what people say about it, that it can make you sick, I'm afraid. They say, for instance, that the 5 years, which is the implant, they will insert something like a needle into your arm and you will not feel normal again. For many women, concerns with hormonal methods and changes in menstrual patterns were important. And this one woman said, this is a young woman who is single, you see, fibroid is caused by blood clots. And when you use some of them, meaning contraceptive methods, it causes your menses to stop. So the blood will remain there and it clots, leading to a fibroid. This is one example. Women talked about getting tumors in their bodies from the menstrual blood that didn't leave. They talked about getting breast cancer from the blood that didn't leave. Condoms were not really considered a family planning method or contraception by almost any of our respondents. So they thought it was okay, actually, for a young, sexually active woman to use condoms even if she wasn't in a relationship, because I think it had to do with the idea of commitment to a method. So you could just go buy condoms relatively easily. It's a temporary method. So they didn't even really think about it as a contraceptive method. They tended to think about hormonal methods or the IUD as contraceptive methods. Okay, so that was another Asked Differently, using vignettes to try and get women to respond about why women aren't using contraception. And this is probably the most Asked Differently of the Differently studies. We're back in the Philippines, back to the cohort of people who are mothers and children born in 1983, 1984. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project that's ongoing now that uses what we call mHealth, or mobile health, to collect data. So as I'm sure many of you know, there's rapid development of mobile technologies in the past decade, and thinking about as mobile health as a method for collecting data is happening, but more often than not, we see people using mobile phones for things like reminders. But we haven't really seen a lot going on in terms of using it as a data collection tool. There are approximately 5 billion mobile devices worldwide, and close to 2/3 of them are in emerging market economies. While many ongoing public health projects address mobile-based interventions, very little research actually has rigorously evaluated mobile methods of data collection. So when thinking about the Philippines, relative to its level of socio and economic development, current use of modern contraception is relatively low at 34%, and 1 in 3 births are mistimed or unwanted. And those of you who are not familiar with the context in the Philippines, the presence of the Catholic Church is quite strong. There have been periods of time in the last few years where cities have banned various methods of contraception, including condoms, and access can be quite difficult. Surveys from the Philippines tend to show very low rates of sexual activity, with less than half of 15 to 49-year-old women reporting sex in the last month, and 15 to 55-year-old men, less than half reporting sexual activity also in the past month. The median age at first sex is about 20.5 for 25 to 49-year-olds, according to the last DHS survey. So we were really interested in reporting on sex, and we decided that we were going to try a methodology that's also been used in psychology called experience sampling method. Usually what people use is some kind of daily diary data where people fill out diaries every day about activities that they're doing. We decided to try and incorporate this methodology on a mobile phone. We used Nokia devices that we bought locally and installed a freely available software called EpiSurveyor. There's information here about the price of the mobile phones, which would be significantly less now than they were then, but it was about $110 at the time of the survey. The phones were distributed to participants following a baseline face-to-face interview. And there's some information about security and text messaging here. That's probably not as relevant. The survey that they received on the phone took place offline, and the surveys were saved to the phone immediately after completion. And after the completion of the study, the data were exported to standardized files. We gave young people a phone for 30 days, and we asked them questions every day for 30 days. There are lots of questions about whether this biases the results, changes people's behavior, changes people's responses, and we can certainly talk about that in the discussion. But the idea was that if we asked them sensitive questions on the phone every day, that they would actually get desensitized to the fact that the questions were sensitive. And we kept feeling like sexual activity was underreported in all of these national surveys, given the sort of nature of the society and the fact that, you know, out of premarital sex is not really acceptable, and, you know, asking on face-to-face interviews was a concern. So this just gives you an example of what the data entry screens look like. And we did ask them how many times in the last 24 hours they thought about sex. I'm not presenting those results, but Surprisingly, less than what we might have thought about. At least when we hear about young people thinking about sex, particularly males, we say, you hear that they think about it all the time. I don't know if it's different in the Philippines or what, but the reports were lower, and the reports were lower among women than among men. At the end of this 30-day period, they were given a baseline survey at the start, and at the end, they were given a face-to-face interview or an interview on the phone. And this is just some preliminary results. We actually have just received our full data set. We tried a pilot first among 32 young people. We now have data on 90 couples for 30 days. And you can imagine that data management is a bit of a challenge. On average, on the 30 days in our main study, they answered questions on 27 out of the 30 days. So we actually have pretty good response rates.
Can you explain what incentive they have do they get to keep the phone at the end of the session?
So, yeah.
What's the incentive for them to answer your questions every single day?
Yeah, it can be really annoying. So we did a lot of sort of formative work to try and figure out what works. The Philippines is sort of the texting capital of the world, and literally the texting capital of the world. I mean, I was there 10 years ago, and people were texting substantially before we were here. The cell phone penetration is high, so you even see young kids with cell phones. So we had to think about the right kind of incentive, and as you saw on that other slide, the phones were actually kind of expensive. They were $110 US. They looked like really cheap phones, though, but it had the right software on it. So we did have some problems with theft of the phones that I could talk about at some other point. But what we gave them was minutes, cell phone minutes. So in many countries, you don't buy a cell phone plan and pay for it month by month. You buy minutes to use, and as you use them up, you get more minutes. And so they participated. The other thing about this pilot was that all of the participants were part of our cohort study. So we thought that the compliance would be better. In the second part of the study, we picked people who were not part of our cohort study, and the compliance was about the same. So either we gave them too many minutes, or they had fun answering the questions. I don't know why they stayed in, but they did stay in the study, and they did respond. Data quality aside, I don't know. Okay, so in this pilot of the 32, and we did in this pilot ask them whether they'd rather answer questions for a month on a cell phone or have an hour-long face-to-face interview. They wanted to answer the questions on the cell phone. So what we find here is just this reporting on sexual intercourse in the past week. And we asked identical questions on the baseline survey. We asked every day whether they had sex on the ESM, which is on the phones. And then we asked about the previous week, which should line up with the last week of the phone-based data in face-to-face or self-administered questionnaire data. And what we find, generally speaking, is that if you look in the middle, you see that on the phone, about 47% reported having sex in the last week. In the baseline period among males, only 37% reported having sex. And on the exit interview, only 27% reported having sex. And what's interesting about that is that the period should have been overlapping between the exit interview and the last week of data collection. But there were some issues around how that data collection was done, at least we're thinking. And we think that people may average things differently when they think about the last 7 days than when they do it on a daily basis. We also find higher reports for females on the exit interview, but they actually match pretty well on the phone-based interview, but those numbers match pretty well with the exit interview numbers. The 43.7 matches up identically. Interestingly enough, there's not the same 43.7 that are reporting on the phone as reporting on the exit interview, which is kind of in the next slide. So in terms of correlation, in terms of saying yes on both things, we find that the ones that I've highlighted, so the baseline versus the exit interview, males reported very similarly. The percentages were the same. In females, the baseline and the phone-based data, we find that baseline data, they reported much lower than they did on a daily basis. So you can see that these kinds of, there are lots of different comparisons that can be made, including this. I don't know why there are black dots here. I'm sorry about that. It's a little bit hard to read. But this is reported yes to having sex on the face-to-face interview versus yes on the phone. And basically what we find is actually that males tend to be more concordant in their reporting than females. They report yes on both and no on both at pretty high rates. There were no males in this small pilot that said yes only to having sex in the exit interview. So you can see there's a green bar for the females but not for males. And then the females are a bit all over the place in terms of their reporting. Okay. So just two more quick things that we're working on in terms of Ask Differently studies. One is a randomized trial of women who were admitted for obstetric complications in a hospital in Ghana, and we want to see whether group counseling versus individual counseling improved family planning uptake. Probably the more interesting methodological one is we collected sort of tournament-style data and played a game with women to ask them why they think some women don't use abortion and why they think some women don't use contraception. And these two are sort of in process. Okay, I'm going to quickly just talk about already asked. I think, in general, we tend not to look at data sources we have as carefully as maybe we should. So one of the things that I was interested in was coital frequency or sexual frequency in sub-Saharan Africa. And we actually used DHS data for this study. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but as many of you know, both in the Bongart's framework and the original Davis and Blake framework, coital frequency was considered either to be a constant or something that didn't vary substantially from place to place. And there's been increasing interest on coital frequency, primarily driven by HIV, but there's also implications for fertility. So we wanted to see whether coital frequency was consistent between and within countries, and I also was interested in the relationship between women's autonomy and sexual frequency. Just to note, we used the question in the DHS, when was the last time you had sexual intercourse with ex-partner? And it's counted in days. And we did something a little bit different than is usually done in terms of modeling. We did Cox proportional hazard models or hazard models, but we went backwards in time instead of forwards in time. And just to note, if you wanted to calculate frequency of sex, it's thought to be twice the median number of days that you have sex. So days since you've had sex. So for example, in Ghana, it would be 28 days, and the median, because the median was 14. And you can see that there's some variation. This is called a violin graph. It's kind of an old code in Stata, but I really like the kinds of graphs that it made. But this compares all the countries that we studied, and the axis is on a log scale for number of days, and you can see that some people reported it was a very long time since they last had sex. So, in Ghana, there's a pretty big bar at 1 year, but it goes all the way up to 10. Rwanda actually kind of went off the chart in length. But the width of these diamonds indicates how many people or what proportion are in that area. And you can see that in Ghana, the triangle's really tiny at 0 days. But in most of the other countries, you actually see a significant proportion of people saying they had sex in the last 24 hours. So, and the dark bars sort of talk about it's kind of like a box plot in terms of mean and median. But basically what we took away from this was that there's actually substantial variation between and within countries. Just quickly, what we found was in every single country, no matter what adjustments we did, women who had more decision-making power had less recent sex. And we can talk about that in the discussion if you'd like. So we find that frequency varies between and within countries. It's associated with women's empowerment or autonomy in the DHS. And the more final say women have in decisions, the less recently they report having sex. So, and just to summarize all these really disparate studies and thinking about the theme that I started with, in thinking about just ask questions, I think we tend to be really worried about asking questions. We think that people won't answer them, we'll get really bad data, we won't know what to do with them. And I agree that the context, and think the context is incredibly important. It's really important to do pilot work, to really think about it. But we shouldn't stop ourselves from asking questions just because we already are convinced people won't answer them. A big problem with this is that there's often no gold standard. So really how frequently are Filipino adolescents having sex? We don't know. There isn't a biomarker, there isn't a gold standard to compare to. So one of the advantages of the ask differently kind of method is that often you can find something to compare to. So when we have things like the DHS that are widely available and many other data sources, demographic surveillance sites, those questions are fixed. The DHS fixes questions across surveys, which is great for doing international comparisons, but may not get as much depth or flexibility in what we want to know. But we can do other things too. So we can do something high-tech, like my student did with ACASI, or we can use mobile phones to collect data. And we can even do low-tech things, like changing focus groups, not to have them ask a series of questions, but to use vignettes and stories to really motivate people to answer questions, not about themselves, but about a situation. Or we could do things like these respondent-driven cards where people circle answers. While there's still no gold standard answer to the kinds of questions we may ask, using multiple methods often allows some sort of triangulation or comparison, and we maybe get at better estimates. And then I think in terms of already asked, we really need to do a better job of mining existing data sources. Sometimes we think there's no data, and maybe there are data out there. I mean, I had used DHS for years and never really thought about sexual frequency or anything like that, and there it was in the middle of the questionnaire. So I think we can find things that we don't expect to find there. So in conclusion, what I've been thinking about next and what I'd like to see asked in the future. So these are all controversial in one way or another, but I would, if people are interested in this, I'd be happy to talk about them more, but I think we really need to start asking. So over and over again, I've been finding that we don't really have any good data on men's sexual health, reproductive health, and in my travels throughout Africa, people are talking about impotence and worried about impotence. There are, Viagra and local remedies for impotence all over the place. Now, it may seem like that's not a relevant question, but I actually think that it is, because things like vasectomy and fear of impotence, I mean, we all know that men are worried about getting vasectomies because of concerns about impotence. And there are a whole host of other things where people engage in practices to prove their fertility. And so I think we need to actually start thinking about what the potential impact this could be. And one of the interesting conversations I had when I was last in Ghana was I was talking to some colleagues who are in obstetrics and gynecology about the huge problem of getting blood banked in hospitals, and the fact that it's one of the things that is leading to some of the maternal mortality in Ghana. And so I said, well, what's the problem? Are people afraid of needles? No, it's not that they're afraid of needles. Males won't give blood because they fear it causes impotence. And so, again, it's not directly related, but it clearly has a public health and potentially a demographic impact. So that's one. The second thing that I think we're not doing a really good job of is actually asking women about their extramarital sexual activity. We are really quick to blame men for the HIV epidemic as we look backwards and see what's happened. We have programs only primarily targeted at men for years. A recent study that came out in Lancet Diseases showed that half of all HIV-positive couples, serodiscordant couples where one person was positive, it was the woman. And there's not much, I mean, the first set of commentary I heard about that was, oh, the women must have had the HIV before they got into the relationship. It couldn't possibly be that they had sex with someone and brought it into the relationship. And so I think it's one of the questions that we really don't do a good job asking about, and I think is increasingly important. And the last area in the Do We Ask section is about infertility. And I know that in general, we find that in places like sub-Saharan Africa, we are never really worried about infertility. We worry about too much fertility. We worry that the TFR is too high. But I've repeatedly heard that contraception, the reason you shouldn't use a modern method of contraception is that it can cause infertility, that women are afraid of this. And so there's certainly things that need to be addressed in terms of contraceptive use, but the concerns about infertility are real. And I think, you know, we also are afraid to ask, what if couples don't have enough children to satisfy them? And again, I know that we've focused much of our energies on trying to lower the fertility and decrease the unwanted childbearing, but there are couples that want to have more children, and there are infertility clinics springing up throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and I think it's a demographic problem we haven't really touched on. So that's the last of these. So I just wanted to acknowledge my funding sources, including the NIH, the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health, some of my international collaborators in the Philippines and in Ghana, and to a terrific set of now graduated, almost all graduated doctoral students who conducted a lot of this research.